Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, great. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. It was very yummy. Hopefully I can keep your attention. So I'm going to talk about bias today. I'm expecting that most of you have heard of bias or have some precursor knowledge about bias. I don't expect this to be new for anyone. But the fun thing about bias is we always have it and we have it all the time. So these are great reminders of that bias. So Michael is going to help you understand more about what causes bias and identify your own bias and then minimize that in your research and your design. I should have gone through that. So we'll start with why biases, and we'll go to biases in our work. It's primarily research focused, but this applies to design as well. And then we'll end with some debiasing techniques. So to start, we're going to talk about where bias comes from in the first place and why we have them. And to do this, I'm going to use some metaphors and some very oversimplified mnemonics to kind of make it a little easier to remember for those of you who don't understand maybe the neurology behind it. So we'll start by talking about decisions. Biases are a feature in our brain that allows us to make very efficient thousands of decisions every single day. For example, estimating how long it will take for you to get to work, picking a restaurant, determining what you're going to eat at that restaurant, if you're going to order coffee, many unimportant but routine decisions that we need to make, and we are faced with thousands of them every day. Sources suggest that the average adult makes 33 to 35,000 decisions each day, including what we'll eat, what we'll wear, what we will say, and how we say it. That could be absolutely exhausting. Our brain can handle this though, right? This is a feature. This is a salesy kind of feature of the human brain, that we can automatically do this without paying attention the majority of the time, including what we see, what we hear, social aspects of our surrounding, how we behave, emotional assessments, how other people are going to behave, how we're going to respond to their behavior from our behavior, all that fun stuff, and so on. These things happen automatically and simultaneously, though because the information that we've stored subconsciously is going to categorize all this as good or bad, right? So it knows what to do because it has learned to make these decisions. We're programmed to handle this load. And we program this with a general rule of thumb. So what is a rule of thumb? If I told you that that means from the end of your thumb to your knuckle, everyone has exactly 1 inch of space, would you believe me? No, because you don't. It's about an inch, hence the name of rule of thumb, right? It's approximate. It's enough to get you by. You can go, oh, okay, that's about an inch. There we go, move forward. Don't have to think about it any further. There's a theory that this comes from the 17th century as a measurement. There's also a theory that seafarers used it, and they could hold their thumb out and estimate from the rocks and from the side of the ocean front whether their boats would be in okay tiding. There's lots of theories about where it came from, but it's an estimate. It is not exact science. Our subconscious uses these rules of thumb to get through a majority of the decisions we need to make every single day. So you can think of this as associations and context. Everything that we look at, everything that we're put against, we create associations, and those associations give meaning, and then the context helps provide additional meaning around that, and we can decide if something is good or bad. A spider in a web, fine. A spider in your hair, not so much. Same spider, different context, creates an association. Guy in a mask, good or bad? Well, it depends on the context. Now, you may start to create context because our brains will jump to conclusions and make assumptions. But if I am talking to you about going to Vail this winter and maybe where the next UXPA will be, I have no idea, by the way, this is a very different context and association than if we change the environment. A mask can be good or it can be bad. So we have to create meaning or we will jump to conclusions. We will use our rule of thumb to create our own meaning. If I asked you to eat this apple, I don't think anyone would have trouble instantly telling me, no, thank you, or just no. Is it because you've thought very deeply about it? Is it because you've analyzed the amount of mold, or is it because you just know mold food Not for me, unless you're really into certain cheeses, and that's a different situation. So you have likely learned associations over time with experience, and you can jump to that conclusion very easily with very little thought. This is one of the fantastic features of our brain. We create all these associations and connections between nodes and objects. You can have one thing like baby clothes and have a number of rules of thumb or approximations about that item based on the context that you are in and what you're trying to make a decision on. Have you ever thought about, or have you ever had this experience? I'm a busy working mom, so I've had this happen a lot of times, but I'm going to assume you've done it too, where maybe you're doing a routine drive, you're driving somewhere that you've gone frequently and you meant to stop, and then you get to the destination and you're like, oh, crap, I meant to go to UPS and I completely went past it. Or you're driving a long distance and you get there and then you're like, I don't actually quite remember getting here. I'm sure I drove safely, but I was very distracted, and yet somehow I arrived where I needed to be. It's incredible that we can do this. We can control our bodies, we can make decisions, turns, work in traffic, and not always be completely aware of our decisions. It's a really fantastic feature. So we're going to talk about this subconscious feature like a Roomba that goes on autopilot, right? This is our brain working on autopilot. Now, if you think about a Roomba, I don't know how many people have them, but they work pretty well on their own. For the most part, they work around your house. There's different versions. Some of them have like GPS mapping of your floor plan. Some of them just bump into walls. But for the most part, they see a black cliff and they don't go over it. Now, there are situations where if you have a very dark carpet, it also won't go over it and it won't get cleaned because it's a cliff. But this is why they're called rules of thumb, right? These are not exact intricacies. These aren't exact correct decisions, but it can get through. It'll generally clean your floor. It'll work for you without any control on your part. So autopilot is the first thing we're going to discuss. You're faced with a decision. Your autopilot kicks in, puts some context and associations, maybe some assumptions, and then gives you a response 33 to 35,000 times a day. Gerald Zaltman, a Harvard Business School professor, suggests that 95% of our cognition, our thinking, occurs in the subconscious mind, not that you're aware of. This is by necessity, because our brains would short circuit if we had to weigh more than 30,000 decisions one by one. It would be absolutely overwhelming. So are any of you wondering about the other 5%? This is the second part that we're going to discuss. This is concentrated work. This is stuff that we need to pay attention to, like doing math equations that you can't just do through rote memory. So I'm not talking about 2 + 2, I'm talking about 27 × 13. Logic, effortful decisions, complicated problems. We're going to call this the expert. You can call on whatever expert you want. I did a report on him in high school, and he's the expert that lives in my brain. They make hard, exact decisions. There are no rules of thumb happening here. But the other part of this is if you're not working, your expert's not working. They're like, nope, not doing it. You have to be a part of it. You have to pay active attention. You have to actively participate. You have to put critical thinking and effort in. There are some caveats to this. When you work with the expert, it can sometimes take so much of your energy that it can literally make you exhausted. Have you ever noticed that? Or maybe you're on a walk and you're talking and someone tells you something shocking and you stop. Because your body's like, whoa, can't process the steps and the decisions at the same time. You're working with the expert, subconscious is turned off. We don't know what to do. We have a very finite bucket of stamina for this type of work. You cannot go through all day and do concentrated expert work, not when you have 35,000 decisions in front of you. So what happens if you don't have the mental bandwidth? What if you're exhausted? What if it has been just an absolutely overwhelming day at work and you are given a critical decision at 4 p.m.? Autopilot takes over. It doesn't tell you, it just slides in and gives you the answer, and you pop out with it. Really interesting study done on judicial rulings by Israeli judges a little while back. imagine that's your day. That's your job. You spend all day doing rulings, trying to determine whether somebody should be let go on probation or what should happen to them. Well, they did some evaluation and they found that these judges were giving more lenient rulings at the start of the day and right after lunch. If you can pick your slot. So prisoners were 2 to 6 times more likely to be released if they were one of the first 3 after a break. I'm sorry, yes, one of the first 3 after a break versus the last 3 before a break. Why is that? You're still making decisions all day long because during the break you got glucose. And glucose gave your brain a little bit more energy so you could keep that expert going a little bit further. Like lunch at a conference. See if we all make it to the end. We put too much faith in the accuracy of our intuition because over is hard. It takes work. We have to pull on the expert. We have to stop what we're doing, stop some of the unconscious things we're doing, focus all of our attention, and get an exact answer. That takes effort. And if you have a pretty good estimate, you're more likely just to go forward with your rule of thumb. So to recap the second part of the brain that we're talking about, decision comes in, the default, context, autopilot, associations. If for some reason you have gone, whoa, this is really important, or something has surprised you or shocked you to pull in the expert, then does the energy exist? And if it does, then you and the expert can spend some time thinking about it, as long as you have the energy to continue working on it, and a decision comes out. So bias comes into play because more often than not, autopilot is serving up the answers. Automatic shortcuts allow us to make decisions quickly, but it impacts our ability to make rational decisions. Now, this does not mean that anybody is doing anything silly on purpose. It just means you don't have time to pull on the expert, right? So you might do something like this. I've probably done this. I'm pretty sure I have. These are mannequins. This line will never move forward. Because you're not paying attention. I mean, you are, but you're not, right? You're thinking about something else, you're distracted, and autopilot is like, line of people, and you stand behind it. Very reasonable. And there are things that we all do on a regular basis where we kind of like, oh, God, I was just being silly, right? So a couple fun exercises. Be honest. How many people said toast on their head? Anybody? I see like a couple like, it's bread. You put bread in a toaster, you get toast out. If a red house is made with red bricks, a blue house is made with blue bricks, a pink house is made with pink bricks, a black house is made with black bricks, a green house is made with glass. My daughters love telling me these jokes. If the 1 hour hand on a clock moves 1/60th of a degree every minute, how many degrees will the hour hand move in 1 hour? Anyone say 360? Anyone say 1? 1 degree. Not because we couldn't do it. I'm sure if we all sat down and really concentrated, we could. But there's a lot of decision making, a lot of attention going on today, a lot of processing. And the easier thing is just to go with your gut, go with your intuition. These are automatic, intuitive responses. So our autopilot biases are just systematic errors in processing due to rules of thumb. There are hundreds of ways that these might inadvertently get us, but for the most part, it is a feature and it serves us very, very well. Wikipedia is a fantastic resource. This is also the Cognitive Bias Codex, which is a really fun one to look through. I can't remember it offhand, but there's actually a podcast, if you look at biases, that goes through every single one by one, which is really interesting. So there are 4 key classifications of these processing errors. The first one is not knowing what information is important to pay attention to. So you have a lot of information, but what do you pay attention to? It's a little overwhelming. Then you've got time and social judgment calls. You're stressed, there's something going on, people are watching, you have to make a decision quickly, autopilot. Having too much information overall, You just have to wade through it all. It's just absolutely overwhelming. And then not having enough context, in which case we make an assumption based on our past experiences and our rules of thumb, and we just have to put our own context to it. So what's interesting, and some good news, is as designers and researchers, we can actually call on the expert. Not often, not all the time, but we can trigger it, and we can trigger it when we're doing research with participants. So for example, if you ask someone how likely something is to be done, autopilot goes, oh, I got that. That's a rule of thumb. They're this likely, approximately, roughly. It's about right. If you need to know how often they do something, ask for a specific number, and that triggers the expert to go, oh, well, let me think about this for a minute. Have you ever had anyone answer you a question, and you're like, would you need the exact number? And your brain's kind of taking this moment and going like, can I do autopilot, or do you really need me to stop and give you a real answer? Because that's going to take a minute. So to review, the expert is effortful, conscious, you got to think about it, and it takes some time and work. But it's reliable. It will get you, for the most part, you know how to do it, the right answer, and it takes a lot of focus. Autopilot, the Roomba, is automatic, it's fast, it'll go around, clean things up, unconscious, you don't have to really think about it, but it's error prone. It is impulsive, it'll just go, it'll take over most of the time. And it can multitask, that's a nice feature. So the expert you want to use for those important things, and autopilot will kind of go for everything else. So that's kind of the intro that we're going to use to think about biases and why these biases are happening. So I'm going to go through a couple different categories. I'm going to go through bias in recruiting, just a few of them. I'm going to go through a bunch of examples of biases in facilitation, because I think this is the most fun area, human on human, most likely to have things take over in weird ways. Then we're going to do analysis, back to you, looking at the answers and trying to figure out what you're going to take out of it. And then a little bit of design, which is research and design. Because as researchers, we have to create documents, we have to create briefs, we have to do share outs. There's design involved in research. I think some people don't think of it that way, but I think of it as design too. So recruiting. So we'll show an example, and then I'll give you the bias behind it. So this is all about the populations that we select participants from. We spoke to users from our ambassador program. Bias involved? Selection bias. When our participant pool doesn't reflect the intended population as it should. If you're trying to understand all of your users, and you're talking to people on your ambassador program, we're looking at people who are very intimate with the software, who are probably advanced users, who understand our processes, who know who to talk. These are not like your general run-of-the-mill intermediate or new entry-level users. So maybe a better way to do this would be, we started with feedback from our ambassador program, but we also included feedback from new users to ensure a more representative audience. Random sampling can also help with this one. So we have to be careful not to apply findings to a generalized audience and be aware of it and call it out. Balance it if you can, but sometimes you can't. I mean, realistically, sometimes like this is all you have and there's a short time frame, and so just call out, this isn't maybe the most representative audience for the research that we're doing. Another example of this is WEIRD. It's a fun acronym. If you haven't heard of it, you've probably heard of things like the Stanford experiment or the marshmallow test. I mean, like, maybe not the marshmallow test, but there's lots of experiments and research that happens at universities. And WEIRD is Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic Participant Pool. Not really representative. Another one you may hear about is medical research, which tends to favor men. A little gender bias there. So this can creep up in a lot of different ways, and sometimes we have no control over it because we have the pool we have, and we need to get the research done, but just call it out if we're not being representative of our audience. This is similar to the last one. A little obvious. It's the best example I could come up with. We ran an online survey to assess access to technology. Anyone get that one? My sense of humor there. So maybe better is we ran an online survey and then we balanced it with an in-person survey at a community center because some of these people clearly don't have access to technology. But where does this come up most commonly? I would say recruiting platforms. They're huge this day. They're a time saver. We pay for them. I'm just going to go to user testing or user brain or one of these online platforms and grab some people and they'll run through. Well, certain types of people tend to be more interested in using those platforms. And then you're not getting the other type of people because they're not signing up for these platforms. So in a way, you've got a bigger pool that you're going towards, but they're self-sampling. Another example of this would be if you do a study on healthy eating habits and you do like a broad sample, people who eat really unhealthy may not sign up because they don't have healthy eating habits. And so are you actually getting a representative sample? This one. So clearly the people who don't like surveys didn't respond. Doesn't necessarily mean that everyone likes surveys. All right, so I'll get into facilitation. I like this one. There's a lot. You don't need to remember all these. And this isn't even like I'm scratching the surface. Additionally, as I go through these, you might be thinking, well, that's kind of like the other one, and this is kind of like the one you just talked about, and this is like the one from the other thing. These cross over in so many ways because it's all about associations and rules of thumb. So there is no like, this is only this thing. You're going to see a lot of overlap. How would you go about buying a new car? What is wrong with this question? So this is future-oriented in part. So autopilot, we talked about this, we heard about this in the first session this morning. What happens when we think future? There are gaps, and we fill them in creatively. We don't necessarily know what we're going to do in the future. We make some major assumptions, and for a big major purchase, there could be some really big misses in there. So a demonstration I enjoy doing for this in workshops is to ask someone to come up and tell me about their morning and how they got ready to leave. What do you want to bet? They leave out weird things like brushing their teeth, putting on their shoes, making the coffee. Does that mean it didn't happen? No. But if we're really interested in their day, there are many other ways to go about this. And the better is not by any means inclusive to all the ways that are better. One example would be having them write down on Post-it notes all the steps that they took, which will help them recognize steps that they're missing, and then have them walk through it as they talk through it. A better one would be going and watching them do it. That's probably the best option. And it's a bit of 2-for-1 here, the serial position effect, because you also have the primacy and the recency bias, which are the first things that you encounter in a series you're more likely to remember, and the most recent or last thing from a series you're more likely to remember, and it's the middle that you're going to forget. So if I asked you about getting ready, you're probably going to start with I woke up or got out of bed, but it's the middle where you're most likely to leave gaps. Another good example of this is lists. Have you ever gone to the grocery store with a list of 6 or 7 items and you get the first few and the last few and you can't remember the one in the middle? What problems did you have when you signed up last year? I know some of these seem really obvious, and then some of them are like, So this is similar to the last one. We want to try and work on not asking questions that rely too much on memory. We tend to fill in those gaps with autopilot, with stories. So maybe a better one is, as a new user, I would like to observe you sign up for the product for the first time. And this is recall bias. We tend to bias our recall and our memories based on our current experiences. If you really love this software and you find the software very easy to use, even if sign up was a little difficult last year, you might color that a little rosier. If you hate the software, you might remember it being a little more difficult. If you're really pulling on creativity to answer this question. You most commonly see this in studies with self-report. This is not the same as forgetfulness. That's different. The importance is the information being recalled is being altered based on current circumstances and experiences. So you want to try and get the questions as close to the event as possible and be very careful of your questioning because you can bias the response. There's a study, I don't remember the exact details, but some of you may have read it about car crashes. And depending on how you ask people, did you see the crash? Did you see the incident? Did you see the window or the glass break? Depending on how you asked, if it was a crash or a collision or a bump, will change how people remember whether the glass broke or not. So the information people provide during interviews is not always accurate or reliable. Often research participants don't know why they do things, or what they need, or what they might do in the future, or how it could be improved, because they're on autopilot half the time. To really understand it, you can't just ask them, you have to observe them. And again, they're not lying. They're not trying to be malicious. They're not trying to make things up or not give you full answers. It's just, we're on autopilot. They got other things to do today. How well did you like the updated navigation? There's a key word in there, which is like. It's a positive word. What are your thoughts on the updated navigation? So we either want to balance it out or ask a neutral question as much as we can. Framing is how we present information, also similar to priming, which is leading up to a question, the things that happen. So for priming, we can be primed by many aspects. Really interesting study where they brought participants into a room that had natural objects. So think like pencils and paper, a backpack, and then they had other participants in a different room that had very business-like objects, briefcases and leather portfolios and nice chairs. And then they brought them together. Randomly, I gave one of them $10, and that person had to decide to split it or keep it. 100% of the natural people split it, and 50% of the business people kept kept the whole thing. So priming, where you do your research can make a big difference on how people respond to the research. We think you'll really love the changes. What do you think? I know some of these are obvious. If you're a researcher, hopefully most of these are obvious, but we may have people in the room who aren't researchers, and we all know product managers and people who don't have training that do research, and this can be very helpful for them. So this example is technically a researcher biasing a positive response through social desirability bias. At this point, you want to please them. I think you're really gonna love it. Do you want to be like, no, it sucks? You're more likely to be like, it's okay. It's nice. You want to be as neutral as possible. Participants tend to answer in ways that they think will be most socially acceptable. And there are so many factors at play when we're doing professional research, because not only have we brought you in potentially physically, or brought you online to our space, not your space to some extent, we are watching you, potentially paying you, and you have to give us honest feedback and hopefully not make it nice on our behalf, even though we're really nice people asking you how you feel about things. There's a ton of it there. So I have a great video that hopefully will play without any problem. If you've come to my talks before, you've seen this. Don't spoil it. It's so fun. It's like 3 or 4 minutes.
By the way, I don't know if you heard about this, but the future of footwear is here because Nike today unveiled what they're calling the first ever self-lacing basketball shoe. This is a shoe whose laces you control with an app with your phone. It's called Adapt BB. They'll sell for $350. This is the reality Back to the Future predicted, right down to Biff being the most powerful man in the world. And the way the shoes work is it's really easy. You just download the app, you create an account, create a password, and a user ID, you sync it to your shoes, and then you just tap your phone until you have the perfect fit, or you could just tie your own damn shoelaces. But it's for basketball. We're beating them at an NBA game tonight. It's going to be awkward when LeBron tells the coach he can't play because he forgot to charge his shoes the night before. You have to charge these shoes around every 2 weeks. But what if you forget? Can't go out tonight. My shoes are at 3%. You know, I've been working on my until next month, but we came up with a fun idea. We went out on the street this afternoon and we asked people if they wanted to test the new self-lacing shoes out, except we didn't give them self-lacing shoes. We gave them a pair of regular Nike slip-ons. Then we had to tell us if they could feel the laces tightening, even though there were no laces in the shoe to tighten. And I'll be honest, one of our writers came up with this idea this morning. I was like, this is not going to work. Nobody's going to believe this. I'm both happy and ashamed to say every single person who tried them fell for it in tonight's edition of Live Witness News.
Okay, great. So the way these work is they're controlled by an app. Okay. And so when I press right and left, each shoe is going to lace up. So I'm pressing the right one, Let me know when you feel it. Are you feeling it tightening on the right?
Yeah.
Okay. Does that feel good?
Yes, it does.
Okay. I'm going to switch to the left.
Okay.
Are you feeling that now?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can feel it. It just adjusts to your foot. It it hugs your foot, basically. It's what it feels like. They feel really comfortable.
So you think it does a better job than if you were to lace it yourself?
Easier job.
So I'm going to press on the right foot, and you just tell me how it feels. Do you feel it tightening?
Yeah.
What does it feel like?
It's just definitely getting tighter, and you can feel, I have really wide feet, so you can tell it definitely forms to your foot a lot better.
And there's also a reflexology mode, which will give your feet a little bit of a massage. So do you mind trying that as well?
It almost feels warm, or like not a vibrating, but you can tell that it's moving around a little bit.
And does it feel good?
Yeah.
I feel it just kind of like, it's almost like suctioning up against my ankles and securing them in place.
There's also a feature that has some heat. Do you want to try that also?
Yeah.
You can press on that. It should be, the heat comes from the ball of your foot in that area. I don't know if you feel it.
Yeah, I feel a little warming sensation.
Yeah. How does that feel?
It's interesting. I've never felt that in a sneaker before. So
there's also a cooling feature for the summertime. So I'm just going to switch it to that.
I think she's just making
you can
things
kind of
up
feel that
and like
transition
pointing at
from the
different
heat
parts of
to
the
the
screen.
cooling. So that's awesome.
A lot of the problem, I have problem with my toes being cold in the front.
There's actually a special toe warming function if you didn't want heat all around. So I can turn that on too if you want to see if that makes a difference. It's sort of just like a little bit of a boost.
Oh, I feel that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Does it feel good?
Yeah, it does.
Do you feel it tightening?
A little, yeah.
What does it feel like?
It's like a slight squeeze, but I feel like it's like forming around my foot, which feels really great. I have like really high arches.
Oh.
So that goes on for a little while. There's a couple of these. If you YouTube Lie Witness News, I think they're fantastic. But what's going on with these people? Like, they're not trying to be mischievous. They're on the spot. They feel nervous. It's a time-sensitive response. You can almost see the moment where they're quiet and they're kind of going like, nothing's happening. And then they're triggered by the, do you feel it? And they go, yeah, I totally feel it. That's impressive. But imagine like this is your research. You don't want to feel like it's a funny situation. So what are you supposed to do? This is not the answer either. So we really have to just, to some extent, assume that there will be bias in your research. You can't be completely inhuman. You're not a robot. They're not a robot. The best you can do is be aware of what most likely will make it happen and try to avoid those situations, or at least have some counterbalancing for those situations in your research. So a couple additional examples in facilitation. Why did you click the button on the right instead of the button on the left? What's wrong with that one? Hindsight. What do you expect to happen when you click the button, and then see what their projected expectations are instead of having them make up a reason why they didn't click the button that they probably didn't see in the first place? So we perceive past events that we're aware of as more predictable because now we're aware of them. It's hard to pretend how we felt when we didn't know what was going to happen. So thinking back to the video, people had some explanations or stories on how they felt about the shoes, and they watched the reporter do something, which I swear it was just a JPEG that said LR, and they just randomly pushed areas. Social bias may have been motivating them, but they were also affected by knowing they needed to come up with an answer. They could tell that you did something, and that they needed to have a rationality for that. They needed to have an excuse or something to say what the outcome of that event was. And a somewhat related study about stockings, older study, Nesbitt and Miller asked store shoppers to pick from a group of stockings the best quality pair. 4-to-1 chose the pair on the right. When asked after the fact, why did you choose that pair? People commented on the color, they commented on how soft it was. Here's the trick, all 4 stockings were the same. It was the position that affected the bias. So you have to be careful about what you're asking, The way that people are going to potentially make up responses, again, they're not trying to lie to you, they're not trying to be devious. Their autopilot is just kicking it, and this is the most likely response based on what you're asking. We often cannot explain, so we justify as best as we can. Subjective experiences are very hard to measure. Do you use this software most of the time? What does most mean to you? Better, daily, a few times a week, a few times a month, less than once a month. Other, you let me know. So a scale being interpreted differently based on subjective understandings or perspective. We want to be precise, avoid words that could lead to ambiguity or rule of thumb responses. The word most has a lot of interpretation to it. So again, this is assumptions and speculation of meaning. I love this one. All relative. How much do you exercise? All the time. I walked up and down the stairs today twice. How many meetings do you have in a week? Estimates tend to be optimistic and exaggerated. If we want exact numbers, we need to find ways to get exact numbers. So maybe a better one for this would be, let's pull up your calendar and look through it. How many meetings did you have this week? Was this a typical week? You're still doing a little bit of estimating, but you're more likely to at least give me a right answer for this week. And then you can kind of rule of thumb it as to whether this one was generally about average. So estimation bias, difficulty providing accurate answers regarding frequency and numbers. Would you consider yourself a novice, an intermediate, or an expert? We don't know what we don't know. So we tend to be really poor about estimating what we know. Even if we are the expert in our peer group, we may be like the low-level peer group, and that might not even quite hit intermediate. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Tendency to under or overestimate your knowledge or experience. A better way might be to list out some of the tasks you do on a regular basis and how long you've been using the product, and then let me evaluate if you're actually an expert with the product. Often the less we know, the less we feel there is to know, causing us to overestimate. We're more likely to estimate up. So the name of this bias comes from a study that Dunning and Kruger did where they had students take humor and logic tests and then assess how well they did on their own test. The self-assessments showed a mix of results overall, but that were pretty poor at assessing our overall competence. However, the more you practice and the more expert you actually are, the more likely you are to assess it correctly. So there is some segmentation as to how well this might be used based on expert audiences. If you're asking a group of experts to assess expertise, they're more likely to know with finite detail, but then you also have to know this as an expert and why are you asking the question? All right, so moving on to analysis. I'm gonna talk about just 3 here: availability, confirmation, and anchoring. I talked to 2 customers this morning. They made a great case for adding this new feature, says most project managers. So that's not enough. We need more than just 2 excited customers. We interviewed 15 of our current customers and found that 13 of 15 would benefit. It got a little bit more weight to it. So the availability of talking to someone this morning that excited you does not justify making a large change. We still need to get a better sample. So availability bias is the tendency to make judgments based on the ease with which examples come to mind. Sometimes it can be hard to wait for that research, especially when something feels so intuitive and natural and confirms what you believe. Everyone has mentioned liking the new controls. It's looking positive. Confirming what we already want to believe. So that's where you want to see this outcome. However, encoding the data, maybe you find that while many people like it, they actually can't figure out how to use them. Because again, there's a difference between what we say and what we do. And it's easy for us to just latch on to the things that work for the way we want it to be. It's easy. Autopilot, done. Day's over. So we tend to conversely be uncomfortable. We'll disconnect with information that contradicts what we believe or is unexpected. So uncomfort is good to some extent when you're reviewing results. Lean into that and figure out why you feel uncomfortable instead of looking for a way to get comfortable with the data. Leveraging analysis techniques and coding models can help with that. Thinking statistically. Our first participant was fantastic and really understood what we're trying to do. I think we're going to see a lot of the same. Anchoring. First participant is not all participants. So maybe better, we've only had one participant so far. It is too soon to speculate. Our tendency to rely on the first pieces of information we get. The place I see this, I think the hardest place is when researchers are pushed to share out feedback early, and then people anchor to the first bits of feedback that they read because the study is still going. And so being really careful about how we put those tidbits out and try to be as objective as possible. Here's a little bit of information. They passed a couple, they didn't pass a couple, but we're still, jury's out. We've got a lot of people coming through. We don't know where it's gonna land yet. So a couple design-ish examples, again, research or design. You can choose how you wanna bias towards that one. So we've got IKEA effect, attentional bias, shedding, and bandwagon effect. I spent 3 months on this. Trust me, I have thought through all the details. No one wants to spend a ton of time on something that doesn't matter, so we can justify the effort by playing a higher weight on the outcome. We tend to like furniture that we build ourselves better. We put more value on it than something of the same price that was just delivered and thrown into our living room. That's where this one comes from. Disproportionate value on things that we've made. So maybe a better is I'm in the final phases. I'm looking for feedback. What might I have missed? Check it over. Give me your honest reaction. I want to get this interaction just right. I'll spend a few more days on it. Have you ever seen somebody rabbit hole into like a share out slide for a very specific micro interaction, and then like you've lost them for weeks, and then you kind of go, what were you working on? Attention bias. I want to make sure I'm working through a checklist is the better approach. Get through the whole checklist and then make notes, parking lot items where you need to come back and spend more time, or you could very easily rabbit hole into things that probably aren't the right thing to be spending time on anyway. So attentional is when we narrow our focus on one or two things and then we overthink them instead of considering the whole. Now, in this case, it could be anything, but there's another one that's very similar. Before we discuss the flows, I'd like to talk about whether those buttons should be green or blue. It's a big stakeholder delight when that happens. Bike shedding. So bike shedding comes from a story written by a guy named Parkinson, or Parkinson's Law. It's called Parkinson's Law, The Pursuit of Progress. It refers to a group discussing a made-up situation of a nuclear power plant. And as the complexity of the conversation increases around the nuclear power plant, more and more people's experts kind of turn off and they zone out. And the next thing you know, the entire group spends hours talking about, I think it was what color to paint the bike shed outside of the nuclear power plant, which is probably not important, but all they could mentally focus on in this story of what bike shedding is. So this is leaving more important matters unattended. Hard details take effort, and it's easy to get distracted by other details. It's also a great example of why it's important to use fidelity in our presentations. Your fidelity should match the stage of your process. If you are in an early share out or a report, make it look early. If you are doing designs, they should be grayscale or drawn, because that will keep the focus at the appropriate level of feedback versus having a high five because the design system makes it easy, but you actually don't give a shit about the color of the buttons. 5 out of 6 competitors have a preview button. I think we should add one too. Anybody ever heard of Apple? Apple's doing it. The bandwagon effect. Adopting designs or trends because you see them in competitors. That's super autopilot. It's everywhere. It's a huge rule of thumb. You see it everywhere. Now, there are also laws to the benefit of this because you're used to it, so it's easier to adopt, but you don't want to do it just because everybody's doing it. So it is attractive to follow patterns that we see elsewhere, but we have to look at the entire picture. We have to be analytical about why or why not something will work for us. So, for example, maybe most competitors have a preview button, but our product allows people to see while they build. So it would be absolutely unnecessary and excessive. Crazy eights are good for this, or playing the why game to go deeper and deeper into why are we doing this. So last little bit here, I'm going to talk about some debiasing tips, just to kind of help get you out of those autopilot modes. Again, you don't need to get out of it all the time. Most of your work, you probably need autopilot to get through it, but sometimes it's really important and you want to pull yourself into the expert. Here's some tips for it. So the first one is to avoid multitasking. We are busy, and I think busier by the year with technology, but it's a core sign that automatic processing has taken on because you can't really multitask with the expert. So try to create a structured approach to your work, prioritization techniques, focus, Pomodoro timer, find ways to like dig into what it is you're supposed to be focusing on. Avoid working on important tasks in a time-critical situation, like right before the deadline or when a time-sensitive decision needs to be made. If you're in a meeting and someone asks you to figure something out ASAP, if you can, offer to come back to them, do a little look into it, get back to you later tomorrow. Try to avoid making those instinctive reactions because it's going to be autopilot, especially if it's important. Be cynical of the obvious. Obvious is easy. Might be right, might not be right. How important is this decision? So it's a sign of automatic intuition or autopilot, not the expert. For example, if something seems too easy, it might be. Have you ever heard that one? Consider all the use cases. Is there something complex you might be bike shedding because it's just too hard to sit and think through the details? Verify all your assumptions. Where you can, root yourself in data, numbers. It's going to pull out that expert critical thinking, math, statistics, data points, quantitative. You can pull quantitative in with qualitative, marry them where you can. Have a data analysis strategy prior to starting so you don't work it towards the outcomes that you want to see without meaning to. Use a coding strategy to go through your data. Define your criteria and your flows and your assumptions up front before you start getting into the feedback. And then the best one, I think, is getting a diverse range of perspectives. Encourage yourself to challenge your own assumptions, get uncomfortable, find a variety of people that you can show your work to, that you can get feedback on, your scripts, your assumptions, etc. Design critiques, research reviews, workshopping around the company, anyone you can show it to, especially in a different situation. So to summarize that, biases are important to how we get through the day. We're not going to stop having them, but we can set up some processes to catch some of those critical moments where we really don't want to be standing behind a line of mannequins in front of our boss. So in summary, you cannot eliminate it, but you can reduce it. You can carefully consider how you sample your audiences, standardize your protocols, be really critical of your questions, quantify where you can, put numbers behind things that are important, and then get feedback and diverse perspectives. If you found this interesting and a nice reminder and you want to learn more or share more, I recommend these two books. Thinking Fast and Slow requires a little more expert attention. You Are Not So Smart, similar and a little bit of an easier read, depending on how you feel you want to dedicate time to it. There's also the Decision Lab, which is an easy reference. It has some product-specific examples and background, which is a nice resource. But there's way more than this, too. These are just a couple that I recommend. And please check out that GIF because I think it's hilarious. Thank you. Also, if anyone has a question for the first question, I have why notebooks to recommend digging into the why behind things, and I have a free one to give away to the first question. If anyone has one. Yep, you. I know, it's like.
Can we have him give his question into the microphone?
Huh? Yeah, we're gonna, sorry, wait for the microphone.
How do you use some of these, you know the biases, you learn them, how do you use them in your actual work? When you're like with a stakeholder and you see them being biased, what's a good way to bring it up?
Yeah, I mean, we're all biased, so you're never gonna get rid of it all. But I think it's just kind of having a lens towards it, practicing it. So, for example, we did some onboarding research recently. And one of the questions that I saw in the research from a very good researcher was, like, how did you feel about onboarding? I was like, you can't ask. Like, think about that for a minute. Can you ask that? Well, maybe I could come up with a better question. So just like challenging yourself, thinking twice about it. Kind of like when we run surveys and we pilot surveys, try to just be a little critical about your questioning, but we're never going to be perfect. So I think it just depends on paying attention when you can and considering what's critical and what's important.
Can I rephrase the question? What do you do when you see your leader being biased and you're in an IC role where you don't have that influence to tell them that they're doing something wrong?
I think, yeah, it's a great question because you don't want to put your foot in your mouth. But I think there are some strategies, like for example, fidelity, right? If you've presented something as a designer, I see this happen all too often out of a design system because it's so easy to just pull the components in and then you see them focusing on the bike shedding things that are not important. Just let it go. I want to have a follow-up meeting. I made some changes, get those suckers in black and white and try again, or show a flow chart instead, or change the way that the data is being shown to focus on the things that you actually need feedback on. Can I give this to you to give him? Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Oh yeah, Mike.
So you mentioned about the fact that we need to snap out of it when we are having that bias. Now it can be tricky to know when exactly you are actually going to have a bias. So could you share of an example where you had a bias and then how did you recover from it?
How to recover from it? Oof. I mean, you have to know you had it in the first place. So I think that comes from getting feedback, getting diverse perspectives, because often we don't know our own. That's part of, the trick of autopilot is we're on autopilot.
Yep.
And so that's where you need people, like a trusted group of friends and people that you can show your work to, do pre-reads with, pre-meetings with, and then they can kind of go, and maybe even ask that so you can prime them a little bit. I don't know, this feels like it worked out just like I thought it would. Is it me or am I missing something? I feel like it's right, but maybe I have a confirmation bias. I don't know. Can you check it over?
Makes sense. Thank you so much. I really like the way I had learned about system 1 and system 2, but I really liked yours way. It was much more simpler to understand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Thomas, Nick? Man, you guys, if you're up here, you got these lights are serious.
Thank you so much for this. This is a really good talk. What I was wondering is, do you have for yourself any particular script or method that you follow when you are trying to educate executives and high-level stakeholders, right? So a lot of the examples that you gave are common misconceptions from, management and leadership, where there's like, oh, I talked to some excited people today, we have to build it, or, and then we have to kind of nicely kind of educate, but some of the education takes time, and you did it today, and showing the clip, showing a real example that's very compelling. Do you have anything, do you start off with a workshop maybe with the executive, or an initial meeting where you get to take your time laying out that there's biases and we're following this process for a reason, and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent you kind of answered it. And every executive is different, right? You have some that are going to listen to you and some that are pencil pushers and they just want you to do it the way they want you to do it. Just people are, people. But yeah, I think being able, if you can, to establish yourself as an expert in your industry at your organization gives you a little bit more collateral to come in and say, yeah, I mean, those 2 users, that is really exciting. And I am thrilled to do a backup study and confirm everything that you're seeing because this is so exciting. And we'll see if it actually confirms it. And just kind of, then get the actual data to see if it worked or not. But I mean, we don't want to obviously make them feel silly in the moment because they're just as susceptible as we are to doing something silly.
Hi. My name is Natalia Rusi, and my question is, many times we have stakeholders that are looking to validate something, and they're looking for researchers for that. And many times there are also researchers that may be on one product and don't have a large team. Are there any strategies or frameworks to assess your, to self-assess your bias, so you can present to these stakeholders that already come with the solution in mind and they just want validation?
I think I followed some of that, but then I got lost a little bit in the middle. So are you saying strategies? Wait.
I can repeat myself. So, so when we work with people that just want validation, and I'm not saying that all of them are there any strategies or frameworks to self-assess your bias so you can be more aware of your own bias especially when you are in an environment that wants just validation of the work?
So I feel like I'm hearing two different questions. One being that sometimes stakeholders just want to hear that they are right like they think they are. And then the other one being how to tell if you're being biased, or like how to show them that they're being biased, maybe?
No, I guess the question is, how can you self-assess yourself to understand if you have any bias, because you already know that you are in an environment that the environment is just the context. The question is, how can we self-assess our own bias?
Check our
Especially
bias.
like getting feedback is great, but if you can't, then how can you self-assess yourself? Is there any framework or something that could help you to make that analysis of yourself?
I mean, yes, there are some frameworks. For example, like the 5 whys is one, where you're really forcing yourself to think critically, putting yourself into a dedicated space, looking at your results, trying to pull data out of it, focusing on very specific details, and just kind of, in a sense, grading your work. On the other hand, we're never going to get rid of all of our biases. Like it's just going to happen. You're going to have bias work, and that's because we're human, and that's a great thing. We just want to watch that when it comes out, it doesn't come out in a way that really kicks us in the wrong way. So I think there are some frameworks and strategies like the 5 debiasing techniques, and there's probably many more out there, but you can only check yourself so far. Does that make sense? And if anybody else has to think of off the top of their head, those are great too.
Hey, I'm Chano Vega. That was super interesting. Thank you so much. I'm curious, keeping in mind the IKEA effect, what are your thoughts on UX designers conducting UX research?
Well, I try to avoid it. I'm very, very lucky to have 2 researchers and 5 designers, and for the most part, the researchers do the designers' research. But data, trying to have analysis strategy before you go into the analysis, really thinking through your questions. I mean, there's going to be some confirmation bias that you're not going to get rid of because you may have spent a lot of time on one thing that you're pretty convinced works well. Bring someone else in to watch the research with you, have them take their notes separately, and then compare, review right afterwards what those are. Try to listen to theirs before you tell them how it was. I think, just kind of pulling in strategies where you're taking the subjectivity out of it.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're about at time. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it.